Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining Thompson Hine's weekly coffee chat series. My name is Mark Miner, and I'm a senior counsel in Thompson Hine's investment management practice group. This is the third webinar in our weekly coffee chat series. These concise and practical discussions will focus on a variety of developments that impact the financial service industries. Joining me today is Tracy Stewart, Corporate Governance Manager at the Florida State Board of Administration. In today's session, we will discuss NASDAQ's proposed new listing requirement for companies listed on certain of its exchanges to address board diversity. The proposed rule would require most NYSE listed companies to have at least 2 diverse directors, including one who self-identifies as female and one who self-identifies as either an underrepresented minority or LGBTQ+. If you have any questions or comments during today's program, we encourage you to join the discussion by using the Q&A box on your control panel. And we will address your comments as we move through the discussion, and we will try to leave some time at the end to answer any questions that you might have. And we will follow up accordingly after the program if we don't get to all the questions during the time together. So with that, let's get started and jump right in. Tracy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So I thought I'd provide a little context by discussing the rule itself, what the proposed rule looks like, and what we are poised to have to deal with as the rule becomes finalized, whatever that looks like. So as those who are listening in may know, in December, NASDAQ proposed a new SEC rule, Rule 5605. As expressed, the intention of this rule was to address diversity disparities at the board level through promoting greater transparency around board diversity for any of its, that being the NASDAQ's, listed companies by first requiring diversity statistics, and later, and we'll talk about what the progression is going to be, eventually adding diversity to its member boards, or stating its rationale for doing so. So let me state up front that there's been a lot of banter back and forth in the news. We'll talk about how extensive the responses have been to the proposed rule. But I think it's important to establish up front that diversity under this proposed rule is not mandated at all at any time for the institutions. That doesn't go far enough for some, and is still too much disclosure for others, and we'll get into that. The proposal, for any of you who have taken a look at it, is quite extensive. I think even just in the substance of the rule proposal, and the commentary is over 270 pages. So hopefully we can get through some of this in quick fashion. The commentary has been voluminous. The comment period, I think it was published in December 11th. I believe that we are up over 150 comment letters for the proposal, and they may have extended the period a little bit. I saw comment letters even being proposed as of a few days ago. So what does the rule look like quickly? It's progressive in its implementation. As I mentioned, it begins with a board diversity reporting requirement in year 1. So from the date of the adoption of the rule, whatever that eventual date is, and a year from that date, any NASDAQ listed entity would have to report statistics around its board diversity or its efforts at achieving board diversity, which would eventually call for female and underrepresented minorities or communities to serve on its board. members. So what does that mean? Diversity in this context means any individual who self-identifies as female or an underrepresented minority or as LGBTQ plus. So then, by extension, the definition of female is someone who self-identifies the female gender without regard to gender designation at birth. LGBTQ plus community is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and or a member of the LGBTQ plus community. There's a little bit of discussion in there, but obviously there were questions about what the extent of that is. Underrepresented minority has more of a traditional list, and it comes from EO language in the federal law, and that group is listed as Black or African American, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian, Native American, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or a mixture of any two or more of those ethnicities. So that's the universe when they talk about adding those diverse candidates. So the progressive implementation would work this way. In year one, every NASDAQ-listed company will be required, that is not excluded, and we'll talk about what the excluded list is, to report diversity statistics, and we'll go over what those should include. Within 2 years of the adopted rules implementation, there will be a requirement to have at least one diverse director or to provide a written explanation as to why the company has not done so or could not do so. And then within 4 years, it is the expectation that the listed company have at least 2 diverse directors, or again, provide a written explanation of its inability or a rationale that it has not done so. And this rule would apply for any NASDAQ Global Select or Global Market tier entities. For those that are in the capital tier entity, they basically get an additional year. So they have a 5th year to meet this requirement. There are also a couple categories that have more flexibility in the rule itself, and they include foreign issuers and some smaller reporting companies who have expressed, as they were putting the rule together, practical reasons why they may have more difficulty achieving those requirements than others, not the least of which that smaller reporting companies have less resources, the impact of adding a new person on the board, et cetera, can be problematic. And so the exclusion is that for smaller reporting companies, I won't go into detail, but there is a Rule 12B2 defines what a smaller company would be. It's partly a formula of assets under management and other financials. They may meet the requirements by having 2 females and other groups not necessarily represented. And for foreign issuers, NASDAQ is taking into consideration that the definitions of diversity or the availability of diverse candidates, particularly underrepresented minority communities, may be different. And so they would use the definitions of diversity that would apply to those institutions where they are. So the form of disclosure, the question would be, what is an appropriate form of disclosure? Essentially, NASDAQ has provided a template, a matrix, if you will, of what this reporting would look like. It's pretty straightforward. It is listed in the proposed rule. It really is essentially a spreadsheet of all the categories that we described and the numbers, and you would have to indicate from year to year whether or not there's been growth or contraction in that area. Consequences. What would be the consequence of not following this rule? First, any company can cure any defect in not complying with this new rule, once they're subject to it, within 180 days of non-compliance, or by the next annual shareholder meeting. And they can do that by nominating a director that would qualify under the rule, or submitting a report explaining why it hasn't done so. There are some companies that are excluded by rule. By definition, they include acquisition companies, asset-backed issuers, other passive issuers who may not have, the types of large boards that other institutions might have, limited partnerships, etc. That list is delineated in the rule as well, and then there's a entire group of institutions that are excluded under NASDAQ's Rule 5700 series. We can come back to that. And then the final adoption deadline, I believe now, would be the SEC has until March 11th to consider all of these things to render its final decision. So that's really the background. NASDAQ has presented extensive research about the positive correlation between diversity and corporate performance. Yet the report acknowledges that there is some research out there that finds that there is a little impact to this difference. But Tracy, I wanted to hear, based on your background and expertise, what your examination of this topic shows.
Yeah, over the years, this has been a pretty important issue. I mean, going back about 10 or 12 years, we had some companies, but mostly investors, coming to us and asking us to join in with their efforts to talk to boards about this. And so at that time, there was a pretty decent amount of literature in the academic space. So, over the years, there's continued to be more added to that. It's interesting to me sometimes. Originally, people came up to me and they said, well, look, here's something that shows that when women are added to a board, it does really well. The people that didn't want an additional layer of regulation would say, well, no, I can point to 3 studies that show that it doesn't really make an impact. And the irony to me is, there was an argument about whether or not adding women or adding diverse people would improve performance. And I looked at it almost the reverse. If you have a management team and you see it prominently in across the market, where they're excluding certain facets of society, they're excluding people based on a number of diversity metrics. You can have gender, you can have race, ethnicity, whatever it is. To me, that can signal sometimes that that's not a very logical, prudent form of decision making, right? So to me, it's almost a harbinger of like, what else are they doing that's like heuristic and possibly has biases and possibly is leading them to make other snap decisions. And maybe it's even something a little bit worse, where you have a board that's not comfortable with people that are different from them. Like what else are they doing in the boardroom that might not be like the utmost logical decisions? So it might not even be that women or minorities improve performance per se. It might be that boards that are doing their job and doing it well are the ones that are open to the entire universe of choices, and they really do just pick the best people. So luckily, we haven't really seen research that suggests that having diversity is negative. The worst that people can point to is studies where it doesn't really make a difference. And that's how academic research is. It depends on the period, and it depends on the way that you define it. It's interesting because it's hard to make an argument organically against it. You would think just intuitively that adding people with different perspective, kind of like the wisdom of crowds hypothesis, that's going to help. And also, it's NASDAQ isn't exactly a market mover on this. Do you know what I mean? It's not an earth-shattering thing that they're doing, even though some people are reacting that way. It's not, like you said, it's not really requiring things. There's a comply or explain element to it. I really think this rule is targeted towards those companies that are like the last holdouts, because most of the companies that we talk to on a daily basis are jumping all over us to show how diverse they are. And that leads to one more thing, and I don't know if you want me to say this now or hold it, but like the way that some companies are implementing their search for diversity, some of them are so eager to make sure that they're not criticized for this. One of the things that we've tended to see over the last few years is that they're really like taking this approach where if there's an experienced person of color or there's an experienced woman, they're like her, she's the one, and so they're tending to stockpile up on the same 10 women. It's like so we noticed this a few years ago. This is some of the research that we actually conducted. We tend to read research about the market, but conduct research about our own individual votes and like how that affects what we are doing. So we looked at our votes. We looked at like the gender layout because I felt like we were voting against a lot of women for being overboarded. We have a policy where we vote against anybody that's serving on 3 public boards because we think 4 or more is too much. The panoply of issues that a director has to deal with today has just grown in intensity. Companies are bigger, they're complex. The world has gotten a lot more problematic, you could argue, in the last 40, 50, 60 years. And there's just shifts in behavior, right? So we're looking at companies that, there's like women that are successful and they're basically like, they've shown that they've got the credentials and the ability to do that. And so everybody wants to give those women or those people of color more opportunities. And that's really, that's the implementation side of this that I think is failing a little bit. We've got to do a better job as a corporate community of giving new people in this diversity set a chance to serve on board, and not just, I call it recycling, not just recycling the old directors that have already shown that they, the purpose is to make sure that we've got a more diverse set. It sets people up to failure if we take the same 4 or 5 people and put them on every board and then expect them to do a really good job. You can't be an expert in that many industries and in that many different companies. So to me, it's like 2 questions. Is this the right thing to do? And yes, most companies are already doing it on their own by far. But B, when you actually are doing this, how are you doing it? Make sure that you're making opportunities in the lower levels of the company for people to move up and get experience. Make sure that you're casting a wider net and not just looking for the small number of people out there with diversity characteristics and trying to like overload them with work. One person can only do so much.
Okay, excellent point. And so it kind of tees up my next question. A lot of the critics of this proposed rule are talking about the perils of a check the box a kind of policy that's not really getting at the substantive of the intent. And you've raised good unintended consequences of flooding a particular individual who was otherwise qualified in ways that can harm the individual. I'm sure we haven't really been able to even completely unpack what happened in the COVID year, but I'm sure that will be coming. And also, even the NASDAQ rule itself suggests that it believes that a supermajority, they haven't said exactly how many, of the listed companies already comply. And the effort is to mandate the statistics to give institutional investors who would find this important additional information. From the perspective of investors, what have you been hearing the import of this data, and what does it say about the trend for the future?
That's a really good question. A few years ago, one of the New York pension funds started making some shareholder proposals to companies to disclose this kind of information. And in particular, they had the LGBTQ criteria. They were one of the first ones to do that. This is a few years ago. And I'm really torn on that. I mean, the purpose of us needing this kind of rule is because not all companies have done a really good job of importing and encoding people of diverse backgrounds into their boards. I mean, that's a fact. We know this. But the trick is when you're asking people to self-identify and then disclose that, like even when New York put that out, and we, we usually work really well with investors. Of course, we don't agree with everything that every other investor thinks. But I remember thinking, it's not really my business to know per se what somebody's LGBTQ status is. I have a lot of consternation about that self-reporting, and even like gender. It never occurred to me that possibly the solution to women and men's disparities was to kind of do away with the idea of gender. I mean, that's one way to handle it, just get rid of it altogether, right? Didn't see that solution coming. But maybe that is kind of, so I'm really torn about the idea of forcing people to make disclosures around things, especially when it comes to, people's sexual orientation, because that's a private and a personal matter. And so it's a catch-22. We need it because we haven't done it, but to require it puts people in a weird position where they have to disclose things potentially about themselves. So, that one I really do think is a little bit tricky. And I think part of the solution has just been the natural progression. When Tim Cook came out at Apple, that was one of the first major CEOs that came out as an openly gay person. So we've got some openly gay people in Congress, and that's a good thing. I'm proud of that for those people. Like I'm proud that they were able to say that, whereas 20 years ago they would have kept it quiet. But I still want people to, not everybody wants to have that in the public domain. Not everybody wants to be known for that. My early career was as an engineer, and occasionally I would have somebody that literally said to my face something like, "You're only here because you're a woman." Nobody wants to feel like they're the token person that got chosen for an attribute. So all of this should be headed to a position where people are appreciated for their strengths and their ability to contribute to an organization. And it's just unfortunate that we're in this kind of like societal growth phase where we really have to kind of mandate it because it has had come from a place of exclusion for a long time. So, when we talk to other investors, we try to kind of hedge this a little bit. Like, you want to make sure, put it this way. I don't know that I want to force board members to disclose where they are on all these different domains. I think we'll know that the progress is being made when companies, by and large, have a really diverse set of people on the things that people do want to disclose, without having to force every person to disclose every element of their personal life. That's the thing that's tricky to me. Like, that's where I can see the more conservative side of this, which is this is a regulation that kind of like starts getting into people's lives and their personal business in a way that maybe isn't what it was intended to do. But we do need to make sure that people have opportunities. But it's the world has changed so much in the last 40 or 50 years. This one's tricky.
Right. We got a comment. Someone said great insight, Tracy. They're really talking about the boardroom dynamics as something that's not necessarily transparent, and therefore performance correlation can be a tall order. More relevant maybe metrics that measure board performance is possibly a solution. One of the solutions to why maybe diverse boards are better. So while there are other reasons, I think the question is, while there are other reasons why diverse boards may perform better, are there any statistics that would support what is it about the diversity itself that produces the superior performance?
That's such a good question. There's one lady that did some research around specifically financial firms. She even collected saliva samples from men and women on boards and tried to link it back to how much testosterone they were producing. So she was kind of looking, even though she was doing financial research, she used kind of like these organic biological measures. And that research was interesting. It showed that it basically showed, if I'm remembering correctly, that some of the women that were selected for boards in the finance industry were more risk takers than other types of women. They had more testosterone naturally in their saliva. So you were almost getting this like self-selection bias, like the women that chose to get into finance acted a lot more like the men. So the other thing within this is that we're all so variable. You know, even though there are some characteristics between men and women, and I keep harping on gender, which I tend to do just because, you know, women are 50% and that's the largest, you know, it's not really a minority group, it's half the population, right? You could make this argument to a certain extent for the other types, but I think, you know, it depends on what the company does. I do believe that having a different perspective can help you avoid pitfalls, and it can help you, like, for example, for decades, women's cosmetics and all these other women's products companies that were marketing products to women, no women on the boards. You can argue that the product needs would have been better met. Now, I'm sure they had women advisors and they had, you know, marketing groups that talk to women, but the fact that you actually have women on the board and women helping make those decisions, I think, is going to lead them to make better strategic decisions. You know, I think you would almost have to pit them against, within that really specific sub-industry, how do they perform against their peers? Somewhat, to me, I don't need it to be better. I don't need the performance to be better. We get away from a basic humanity argument if we insist that there's a performance improvement. You don't want to give women and people that have been historically disenfranchised from board service opportunities because it's good for the company per se. You want to do it because it's the right thing to do for the world. It's wrong to discriminate against people. So I've always said, you know, even if it's a wash in terms of performance, so what? Do it. It's the right thing to do. But I do think that there are cases in which having those different perspectives and those different life experiences that's diversity across everything. That's diversity across geographic, age. You know, it's not just. It's basically trying to create a board that isn't just people like you. And that's the thing. If you look at age, they are just as insular in terms of, like, historically, where they want people like them. You know, so it depends on what region of the world you're looking at. It's human nature to be a little bit tribal and to be a little bit distrusting of outsiders. That's a little bit in our, you know, caveman kind of DNA. So that the right thing to do is to get past that. And I really do believe that, and I think it's merited out in a lot of the research that there are performance improvements. But the bigger argument is you really don't need to have performance improvements to do it. I mean, like, it's just the right thing to do. It makes sense that if you're trying to make a board, you should look at the widest version of your marketing and or your talent pool as possible. It just makes sense that if you leave off huge swaths of the population, yeah, you can still probably find good people, but over time, the entire market loses out on a huge pool of talent. A huge, crazily untapped pool of talent is lost. So it's almost hard to say on a company by company basis, would the company be better? I can tell you that the world is better. Like, in the long run, the talent that's used and more properly put to use, that's like, I just refuse to believe that it's anything but a good thing for us to make sure that people that are talented get the opportunities that they need to contribute to the world.
Well, I couldn't think of a better way to close out. Look, 270 pages is a lot for anyone. The reading is a bit of raw justice. NASDAQ makes the point that it is morally the right thing to do, but the statistics that they cite to, most of them support much greater performance, or notably greater performance with gender or ethnic diversity on the boards. Even that boards that have more women get in less regulatory trouble, which is a whole nother topic we'll have to save for another time. We have a few questions we couldn't even get to. But look, with the Senate Republicans on one side asking to kill this, and the Urban League saying that because it's not mandatory, it doesn't go far enough, I'm sure we haven't heard the last of this topic. So I definitely want to thank everybody for their attention. The next coffee chat in the series will be hosted on Wednesday, February 24th, and our colleagues will be discussing tools for building, will be handling other topics beyond diverse boards. So thank you for your interest in attending today. And thank you, Tracy, for sharing your insight When this webinar ends, you'll be prompted to take a survey. We always enjoy your feedback. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks for participating.
Thanks, Mark. My pleasure.